Hi, I'm Warren Cornelius, and you're watching Breaking the Cycle in Open Studio. We'll help you make informed choices about the prevention, treatment, and recovery of substance addiction by consulting experienced professionals and finding evidence-based solutions. Welcome. Today we'll be discussing the treatment of adolescents and children, and with us in studio today we have Mark Delleray, a clinical psychologist. Welcome, Mark.
Thanks, Warren. Great to be here.
Great to have you. Mark, tell us a bit about yourself and the work you do.
Okay, so as you said, clinical psychologist. I've been working in adolescent work or children work for quite a while now, about 9 or 10 years. Prior to that, I worked in addictions treatment specifically with adults and so on. And in the last 8 years, I've specialized, I suppose you could call it, working with young adolescents, working privately and at a clinic.
Great to have you, Mark. So, Mark, let's get right to it. It's a common thing, like when parents come, they often think, like, how do I know that my child has a problem and it's not just normal teenage behavior?
Correct. It's a very difficult time because, you know, if you've had children and you have adolescents, you'll know that their behavior can be quite erratic. Sometimes from moment to moment, from day to day, they might change. But I think it's important that we recognize that that is there before we sort of decide what is happening with our children. And often as parents, we sort of looking for signs. You know, people say to you, look for the signs. And, you know, common ones, old ones used to be, look at the red eyes and maybe weight loss and so on, which is still relevant. But nowadays it's a bit more problematic because our kids are on their screens and whatever, so they might get red eyes from that. So it's a bit difficult for us to sort of fiddle that apart. Also with the weight loss, sometimes kids are wanting to lose weight and so on. So those are the signs. But I think the main thing that we need to look for is pervasive changes in patterns.
Okay.
So that's why it's important for us to be aware what our kids are doing, not knowing everything that they're doing, but just be aware of their normal sort of routines, their normal patterns of doing things. And once you start seeing a big shift in those patterns and routines, then you should start, you know, taking more note. And what I mean by that is not that, you know, your child wakes up on a Monday morning and they're really irritable and whatever, and then you sort of immediately worry about them, because that's that normal sort of teenage stuff. But if, you know, for a week or two now you've been seeing a change in that and they don't want to go to school, or suddenly now they are indoors all the time, or alternatively outdoors all the time when they were indoors all the time. So there's a big change in that. And then yes, irritability, things like that, that's a sign that also there's something is happening underlying. And perhaps in the way that they're communicating with you. Maybe they would sit at the table with you and have supper or whatever. Now suddenly, no, I don't want to be around you anymore. But again, not just for one night, but for several nights or maybe a few weeks in a row. So again, I always emphasize that a big change in the pattern of their behavior is what you need to look for.
Yeah.
Those are the main things.
So what happens in a case where, like when children transition into adolescence and they obviously kind of withdraw and isolate, and how is that behavior? Because that's normal behavior. How is it different from somebody whose behavior is changing because they're using substances?
So the changes in behavior with the substances, you're going to get, again, more profound changes. So the swings, the mood swings, the changes are going to be much bigger very often. And also their need to interact with you, or let's put it this way, their resistance in interacting with you is going to grow.
Yeah.
So you get the normal teenage behavior, as you say, where kids are sort of separating from you, their friends seem more important to them than you are, but that's part of the developmental process. But when they're really becoming resistant and avoidant to even sharing with you, talking to you about anything, then you're starting to see a big change. That resistance, you'll feel it almost, I want to say, as a parent.
Yeah. So tell me something. If you suspect your child using substances, what is it? What do you do?
So look, there's a lot of things that a person needs to look out for. Is that part of the developmental process often is that kids will experiment. So you know, we're not saying it's okay, but it's naturally there. They might try some substances or behaviors that we wouldn't approve of, but they are trying them. So we have to be careful that, you know, if you do catch your child with cannabis or something like that once off, not to necessarily take him straight to a clinic. It's about maybe engaging with your child there. But then it's about what are the levels of what's going on. How bad is the behavior? How bad is the situation? So sometimes a person is looking at, maybe if you're engaging with your child, understanding what's going on with him, it could be that maybe there's some school problems rather than there's substance issues. If we go directly to substance issues, if there's substance issues, then a person needs to start looking around. There's a lot of NGOs that work with us. There's obviously, if you are lucky enough to have medical aid or those kinds of things, there's clinics that a person can approach. But I think at a local level, there's a lot of NGOs and community-based programs that you can approach, outpatient programs, to talk to. And maybe even it's not taking your child there first, maybe speaking to someone there, understanding what's going on.
Yeah.
So, yeah.
You're speaking about like the severity levels, and I wanted to know, like, can you tell us a bit more about like substance abuse and substance addiction? Because often in youth, it's the early onset of substance abuse.
Correct. Yeah, you know, very often in South Africa specifically, we talk about substance abuse as if it is addiction, which it's not. There's substance use, there's abuse, and there's addiction. Very seldom with adolescents or even with children would you be speaking about addiction. It's very early stages. Usually it's a sign of something else underlying to that. So when you talk about substance abuse, the abuse is usually related to them trying to change how they feel, to feel better, or to fit in.
Yeah.
So that's the level before it becomes something that they need to use almost, I want to say, to feel normal. They start feeling that's when you've moved into the sort of addiction phase. It's a very rough way of putting it. Yeah.
Okay. Tell me also, like, alcohol is a legal substance, and that has been decriminalized. So how does that impact your work with adolescents?
It's very interesting because you know how clever our youth can be when it comes to things like that. The first thing I'll tell you is, no, it's legal now. Even if they're 15, and if you come back to them and say, well, it's, it's at age 18, they'll say, but it doesn't matter, it's not criminal. But anyway, I guess the point about that is that we start talking to them not so much about what's wrong about it, but how it may impact their development. You know, you talk to them about what are their dreams, what do they want to do, and they say, well, I want to be, a musician, or I want to be an accountant. And I say, well, you have to think about how any substance, never mind cannabis or any substance, might affect your brain development. So we go at that angle, because you know with younger people, if you tell them what they shouldn't do, that's probably
what they're going to do.
What
What is the developmental concerns later in life for somebody if they using substances early in life?
So what sort of the science or literature shows us is that people who tend to start using or abusing rather substances at below the age of 15 as one level, and then below the age of sort of 21, the likelihood of them becoming addicted is much higher compared to other populations of people who start using later. And that is mostly because of the developmental delays it might induce through the substance actually affecting your brain. Because, I mean, if you use any substance that causes you to feel intoxicated or high or whatever it is, it's obviously working on your brain. And because your brain is still developing, both physically and neurologically developing at an early age, it will affect how those pathways are sort of grown, if you want to put it that way. And that's where the problem comes in.
Sorry to break your word there, Mark. We're going to be right back after the commercial break. Thanks. Welcome back to Breaking the Cycle and Open Studio. We're chatting about the treatment of substance addiction in youth and adolescents, and we're chatting to Mark. Mark, tell us, we found that often people have an underlying mental disorder, and that leads to them using substances in the first place. What can you tell us a bit more about co-occurring mental disorders?
So I think that's a very important point, because especially amongst the youth, if we exclude the normal experimentation stuff, usually there's something else going on underneath there. Perhaps some level of anxiety. If we talk about the base conditions, would be anxiety and depression. Coming out of that, you might start seeing some other behaviors which are related to them trying to cope with that, which would be things like self-harm. I think a lot of people have heard of that before, self-harm. And also then obviously substance use or abuse in a way of trying to cope with that. But then when you talk about anxiety, it's not just your normal anxiety of being worried about your tests. So you're a little bit stressed, you write it and it goes away. It's an anxiety that's possibly been building over a number of months or years. So it becomes very, very difficult for that adolescent to manage that. And very often out of that, depression will develop. So even if we exclude any kind of traumas, which even make it worse, then depression can develop out of that, because they're trying to function amongst their peers on a normal level, but because they have to carry that level of anxiety, it takes a lot of their energy away. And that leads to the depression, and then also sometimes substance use or the self-harm, as I was saying, to try and deal with it.
So let's talk a bit about depression and bipolar disorder and anxiety disorder and other co-occurring mental disorders that we have. And where does it stem from, and what can adolescents do to not use substances to self-medicate?
Okay. So, when we talk about depression, anxiety, all of those conditions are on sort of a scale.
Yeah.
You can have mild depression up to major depression. And then also something like bipolar is more complicated, because then it is something that is sort of on a chemical level, neurological level, that needs medication very specifically. Whereas with other depression, yes, you may need medication, but it's more about the sort of therapeutic and counseling input that comes from there. But when we talk about that, I think it's important that if we are noticing that or suspecting that there is an underlying mental health condition, then as parents, that should be the first port of call. We should be the ones then initiating some kind of connection with medical service, be it with your local doctor, be it with the local social work center, or a psychologist, or so on, because that can start complicating or getting very complicated very quickly, and that might lead to even more severe things like what we're having lately. Almost want to say a pandemic or so of suicidal thinking and behavior.
Okay. ADHD is quite common in the youth, and it also leads to substance use. Tell us a bit more about ADHD and how it plays, or the untreated ADHD plays a part in the later substance addiction.
Yes, absolutely. So I'm not a psychiatrist, so I don't want to say I especially know about the medications and so on, but if you look at the literature around that, children who do have ADHD, specifically ADHD, and again on another level, ADD, very often with them untreated, if it warrants them having medication, leaving it untreated because of the fear that they'll become addicted to the medication. Often, if you look at the studies behind it, it shows that more of those children move into substance use than not. So in fact, it's by trying to protect your child from becoming addicted to the medication, you might inadvertently be causing them to use something else to help them manage it.
Okay. Let's move on to self-harm. You spoke about self-harm earlier on, and what is self-harm?
So self-harm or self-injurious behavior can take any form.
Okay.
I mean, people often think about cutting as it can be scratching, it can be rubbing yourself, it can be pulling your hair out, knocking your head against the wall, literally any kind of punching the wall, because the wall always wins kind of thing. So, self-harm is any form that where you're causing damage to yourself, harm to yourself. Usually that is a means of coping, okay? Because when we harm our bodies, or our body gets harmed in some way, there's a physiological response. So what happens is, if a person is, we call it overexcited, and I mean in a sort of a psychological sense, then when you self-harm, that physiological response from your body is to down-regulate. So you feel calmer. So it sounds strange when kids talk about it, but it down-regulates. Or some kids have been feeling emotions to such a degree they become numb. Now they start saying, okay, well, when I self-harm, it feels like I'm alive, or I'm normal. Okay. And there's a whole lot of other stuff goes with that job.
What are some of the signs of self-harm that a parent can look out for?
Okay. I think some of the most obvious ones, because kids become very ingenious at hiding it, because they're not really looking for attention. They want to hide it away from you. So some of the most obvious ones would be middle of summer and your child's wearing long sleeves, long pants, where normally they might have been wearing little short tops or things like that. So that would be a thing. Or suddenly now, when they would not mind too much if you sort of walked into the bathroom when they were busy, now suddenly they'll lock the door, they'll keep the door locked, or they'll not want you to come into the rooms at certain times. So that's when they're starting to try and hide from you what's going on.
Is there any specific treatment approaches for self-harm?
It's a very difficult one, because it's not necessarily that you're targeting the self-harm per se, because the self-harm is kind of a symptom or a coping mechanism. So it is then looking at the underlying anxiety and depression. So then you would be going at, looking at treatment for depression and anxiety. There are some that seem to be a little bit better than just your general approach, which would be your DBT, which stands for Dialectical Behavioral Therapy approach, is one of the ones which seems to be quite effective, but there are others as well.
So what kind of facilities are available for youngsters looking for treatment for co-occurring mental disorders and self-harm?
So again, like I say, if you have I just want to say the luxury or the luck of having a medical aid or a hospital plan given, there are some private facilities that you can go to. But the government also, the local government and national government does have programs that are running. If you go onto the websites of social development and the government websites, there are In fact, I printed them out myself the other day. I think there's 20 pages of different things that are available. Not all of them might suit your child because of age and because of what they are, but there are quite a few facilities that a person can look at. And then there's also NGOs. There's a South African Anxiety and Depression Group that has facilities. Cape Mental Health. There's quite a few ones. Yeah.
Okay, great. So just to summarize the co-occurring mental disorders and how it affects substance addiction. So if we can pick up as parents co-occurring mental disorders, the anxiety and the depression and stuff like that, it kind of limits the risk factors for a youngster to become a substance user later on.
Yes.
Sorry to break your word. We're going to have to cut and go to a break. We'll be right back after this. Thanks. Welcome back to Breaking the Cycle in Open Studio. We're chatting to Mark Daleray, a clinical psychologist, about the treatment of adolescents and children. Mark, so we're speaking about self-harm and the treatment of co-occurring mental disorders. And what other interventions are there for the treatment of co-occurring mental disorders?
So maybe also look at or talk about the severity of those conditions, because everything is sort of on a continuum. You know, I said earlier, there's sort of a spectrum of things from mild to more severe. And again, if a child is developing some level of anxiety, depression, substance use, substance abuse, it doesn't mean they necessarily have to go into a clinic. Sometimes there's also starting at a lower tier. For example, their anxiety might be related to school.
Yeah.
So it might be, you know, if you can understand, if they're willing to tell you at least where the anxiety is coming from, it's then maybe approaching the school. If the school has a counselor or a guidance teacher or someone that does that, starting to look at that and how we can assist them at that level, that means that we prevent them from maybe moving further into more anxiety and then using other things. If it's moved a bit further on from that, then a person needs to start thinking about, okay, well, where's this coming from? If it's not something very specific to the child, maybe it's also part of our system, because our children are, you know, we call it part of a system. A child doesn't live in a vacuum, so they're part of a family, be that an extended family, whether it's mom and pa looking after them or whether it's their direct, you know, parents looking after them. So there might be other situations there where the family needs help, not because the family is doing something wrong necessarily, but that's where we start talking to our social workers and people like that. They're not geared up nowadays to step in and take your children away from you. They want to keep the children at home and in that environment. And you know, with all our financial situations difficult at the moment, that might be the next level, because it might be a systemic problem or difficulty. And that's where social workers can come in and help, be it with you know, part of the education, with therapeutic input, even with food, you know. So that might be the next level. Then we talk about the next tier after that. Now we're talking where it's something that the child is profoundly ill now. You know, severe depression. They even the self-harm might be there. They might be starting to talk about, I don't want to be around anymore. There might even be suicide attempts. Then we have to really ramp it up a notch from there. That's when we start to talk about seeing medical professionals, be that your local doctor. Maybe just a quick step back. You know, the previous levels. It could also be if you're part of a church. Then you're talking about your community intervention there. You're talking about going to see your pastor, going to see the church counselor. So that might be part of it. But the next level that we're talking about now, the more severe one, then we need to take it seriously in the sense that as parents and as lay people, we might not have the knowledge to deal with that. And then you need to go and see even your GP. Go and see your GP. They can refer you on to either one of the local clinics or go to the local clinic, get help there, because that will then ramp up the call to a social worker who's trained, a clinical social worker, a psychologist, or if necessary, a psychiatrist, and then perhaps even hospitalization. So our first port of call is not necessarily the hospital or the clinic.
So let's look at those different severity levels that you spoke about. And the first one you said was really mild, and it's kind of at a school level. Let's say the child is underperforming at school. Oh, he's failing grades, whatever it might be, his grades is dropping. How important is it for the educator or the teacher to communicate with maybe social development, with a social worker or the parents, and find out like what are the underlying reasons, or what, you know, for this child's dropping in academic achievement?
Yes. Look, I know we also have to give our teachers a lot of credit. Some of them are sitting with
under-resourced.
40, 50 kids in the class, and unfortunately that's where some of our kids fall, and not because the teachers are not willing, but there just isn't time. But I think it is important then to, if the child, first of all, is willing to engage with the teacher, talk about that. And then, depending on what it is the child's telling you, if it's something that seems that you could talk to the family about, then it is contact the family, call them in, have a chat with them. But if that's not there, if there are other things, then we need to start. I know the Western Cape Education Department does have their counselling team or group, which is social workers, psychologists. You can access them if there's something more severe, something happening at home. Even if it's not at home, if the child has experienced some kind of abuse or some kind of aggressive behaviour in the environment, then you can contact them. And then it is from there, also then going up to calling social workers. So the problem is, I was going to say, if you call social worker immediately, if it's not a problem, you might alienate the family from communicating.
Okay. So tell me, so let's look at that early stages and that early intervention. And it sounds like communication is the biggest, the best intervention at that severity level, and that's that mild severity level. It's communication between the teacher and the learner. It's communication between the teacher and the parent. It's communication between the child and the parent. And communication is all about effective communication, because often, I know it's often very cultural, and parents don't want to hear the side of the child. The parents always right, and they don't tell me kind of thing. And it's important for us to listen to our children, and that's. Let's move on. We've got very little time left, and I want to touch on the second level of severity, which is like the moderate level. What did you say was the interventions over there?
So there could be where again we're talking maybe where there is more of a systemic issue. So there might be issues in the family. Maybe it's not that there's any abuse or problems, but maybe both parents have lost their jobs and they're struggling financially, and those kinds of things. That's where we need to perhaps start bringing in the social development or social workers as well to assist the family, not to take the children, but to assist the family. And if there's more help needed for the children or the parents or anyone in terms of counselling or therapy, they can help. And after that, we would get to the more severe level where they would maybe even there say, listen, we think the child should see a psychologist, or the child should see some.
And I think it's at that level that faith-based organizations and community interventions are vital. So let's talk about community interventions, and what does community interventions look like to you?
You mean the dream, or what we do?
What's currently available?
Yes, I think my dream or passion would be for us on a community level to be way more involved with each other, in a helping fashion. But look, there are a lot of groups, like I say, NGOs, faith-based community groups that are very open to helping on all those levels, be they at feeding scheme level to family assistance level to activity programs and things for kids. And there's a lot of them. I mean, if you just actually look around your neighborhood, you'll see it might be the most obscure little place, and there'll be a sign there that says something, and people are willing to assist. And I think that's where we need to start looking at it.
Okay, so just before we end the show, we need to speak about like the treatment, like the severe, when somebody has a severe problem with substance use disorder. What treatment options are available for teenagers then?
So like I said, there are.
Let's speak about somebody who's got resources and somebody who doesn't have resources.
So somebody who has resources could access. There's several clinics that do that. And again, if you Google that, you'll find, you're just looking for look for adolescent psychiatric treatment. And that would come up. There you're talking about, if you're on a hospital plan, you have a PMB which will allow your child to go there. There might be some limits in the time, but you can actually you don't have to have the top tier medical aid to do that. All people who are on medical aids or hospital plans have the right in South Africa to access treatment. Okay, so that can be used. Then again, it becomes quite difficult when there isn't finances. And that's when we need to start looking at some of the government facilities.
Mark, sorry to break you there. Thank you for coming onto the show. We've run out of time. I hope you're going to come join us again for a second season. Thank you for joining us, audience. Next week, join us for the treatment of adults and older people. So I'll see you next week. Keep safe.